Okay, hello and welcome back to New 303, Hypotheses of the Unconscious. This is Saints or Wizards, Part 2. So in the first part of this lecture, we began by looking at, or at least beginning to look at, sort of the relative cultural notions across many cultures of saints or wizards, that is to say, monks or sorcerers, right? Two different kinds of cultural figures, cultural practitioners, that seem to differ in certain respects, and yet both offer a certain kind of window into the sorts of capacities people might have to interface with their own cognition and thus with the unconscious. And these are figures who obviously carry a great deal of cultural weight, right? So we began by sort of looking at the ways in which, in some ways, people have attempted to differentiate these things. And we didn't exhaust ourselves on those schema too thoroughly, in part because part of the point that I wanted to make is the real difficulty that one, in fact, has in doing so. Although there are sort of feeling tone distinctions for many people, often those things are sort of derived from a cultural standpoint, right? One person's priest is another person's warlock. And so there are those issues. And although we're going to come back to attempting to get into some of those differentiations, the thing that I wanted to draw out, and sort of where we left off, was the way that we see both of these traditions in some sense emerging from an earlier common human tradition, which is to say the shaman. Now, I mentioned already that I'm using this term somewhat provisionally, just because it is one of the sort of better terms around, and is not, strictly speaking, neutral, right? The term shaman is originally derived anthropologically from certain kinds of, indigenous practitioners in the Siberian cultures. And so it's a little tricky to try to apply these across the board, but there does seem to be a certain amount of universality, okay, to this, which is to say that we see these kinds of practices, shamanic practices, turning up in cultures all over the world at a certain point. Indeed, there's some evidence, as I mentioned, around sort of cave paintings and things to indicate that the emergence of shamanism may have been, in fact, one of the drivers of kind of a certain kind of cognitive and cultural complexification that humanity went through at a certain period, depending on your dating, maybe about 35,000 years ago, possibly further back. So this is a very old set of traditions that was developed. And we indeed see both the descendants, the inheritors in some sense of these traditions, but also in fact, some continuous versions of these traditions operating even today, contemporarily. Now, although the shaman is often associated with kind of hunter-gatherer social organizations, and seems to be largely superseded by these more differentiated streams of sort of religious functionaries in the strict sense and magical functionaries in this sense, right? The shared tradition does in fact continue in lots of places. So you can find a syncretic shamanic tradition, for instance, among the Bwiti in West Africa, a group that I mentioned briefly in connection to the initiation, the shamanic initiation, and sort of medicinal diagnostic psychoactive iboga tabernanthe, right? We find an ongoing somewhat syncretic indigenous shamanic tradition, right, occurring in around Central and South America, right, around ayahuasca. So again, we mention it because it has this link to the use of psychoactives, right, these particular kinds of shamanic drugs. And indeed, there are traditions that we find all over the place. In some cases, those traditions, many cases, those traditions are syncretically blended with background religion. And so there are some sort of interesting suggestions that this may have occurred in what we think of as voodoo, right? And Candobla, and a few things of this kind, right? Where we see a kind of syncretic tradition that blurs in some Christian concepts, but also takes many of the sort of original concepts that were sort of indigenous to the people in question and blends them together into something that retains a certain aspect of shamanic practice and shamanic tradition, but conceptually alters them to include other sort of more organized, I suppose, orthodox religions like Catholicism, for instance. So we do see these threads continuing in sort of many cultures in many areas. But it's a very old tradition in a certain sense. And it appears that there are sort of sharp commonalities, both between the currently existing groups and in terms of what we've discovered in the paleological evidence, right? When we look back over archaeological and paleoarchaeological evidence of early humans operating this way. So a few of the things that I mentioned in this respect around shamans, right? And this is obviously something of a broad overview, but we tend to find that within a given group, like within a tribal group, the shaman often has the largest vocabulary in the group, right? So they have more words, a larger average vocabulary. And they tend to have not just more words, but also sort of a larger abstract vocabulary. So they tend to have more abstract terms than many of the other people in their cultural group. In keeping with this, they're often the keepers of certain kinds of specialized forms of knowledge. So this isn't universal, but very often it's the case that they possess a substantial sort of botanical and ethnobotanical repository. So, right, in the case where the shamanic tradition continues to use certain kinds of psychoactive plants and fungi and so on and so forth, animals, which are local to the area, they may have a very rich set of knowledge that is not commonly shared, right, among their fellows. So there are certain kinds of specialized knowledge that they possess. That often also includes sort of metaphysical and narrative knowledge, which is to say they are often the keepers of certain kinds of mythological structures and stories, right? And the keepers of certain kinds of rituals. They are the ones who both know how to conduct certain kinds of rituals, and also they are sort of necessary to do so. Furthermore, we see, generally speaking, that they often have a higher degree of cognitive flexibility. So they tend to be sort of more flexible thinkers in a number of ways in testing. And very interestingly, they often possess a significant measure of what we're going to shorthand here as charisma, which is to say that they have force of personality, right? They have force of personality. Now, charisma is a bit of a slippery concept. It's not something that's terribly easy to operationalize, although we are going to try to come at that as we go, the idea of operationalizing it. One of the other things, however, that is really central to these sort of shamanic traditions, right? I've already mentioned how they're the gatekeepers of certain kinds of myths and rituals very often, but as an extension of that, they are generally both sort of possessed of a greater degree of access to different altered states themselves, right? And they tend to be the cultural gatekeepers of access to, right, altered states of various kinds. So, for instance, if they are present in conducting an initiation ritual, for instance, this very often involves an altered state. And depending on the nature of the initiation ritual, right, this may in fact involve, as I mentioned, for instance, with the Bwiti, very large doses of an iboga brew are used in initiation. They're part of the ceremonial ritual transition that turns somebody, effectively speaking, within the context of the culture, from a child into an adult, right? So they are, in some sense, the gatekeepers on that. But they may also be the gatekeepers on other forms of altered states. They're often the ones who are conducting these rituals, and by extension, the ones who are either administering psychoactives in that context or using various of the other sort of endogenous, exogenous, and as we'll linger on, psychotechnological modes in order to shift people's state of consciousness. So drumming, dancing, storytelling, mime, ritual, okay? And in keeping with this, when we're talking about them as these figures who tend to have specialized knowledge, tend to have a greater sense of affordances with the environment, tend to have greater cognitive flexibility, tend to have greater and more abstract, like larger and more abstract vocabularies. They're often very strange figures, sometimes somewhat marginal, right? Indeed, it is not uncommon in many cultures for people who would be considered mentally ill in Western cultures to instead be recognized as part of a shamanic tradition. So this has been noted in a number of anthropological cases where people who are showing signs of schizotypal personality or sort of straight up, schizophrenic presentation will often have that interpreted within the cultural context as being possessed of a certain kind of special relationship to the unseen world, right? To the spirit world and to the world of sort of myth, the gods, spirits, and magic. And often it is the case then that those people are sort of taken under the tutelage of an existing figure, and there is a kind of apprenticeship system. Very often it is the case that, not always, but very often it's the case that shamans are sort of not allowed normal social relations. So they perhaps are not taking a spouse, they're not having children in that way, and so there is a kind of indirect line of transmission that we see there. So these, sort of early gatekeepers, right, of altered states, as I mentioned, have a number of really crucial functions within their culture. In some cases, they may be sort of the only medicinal, right? The only medicine, the only medical intervention that a group has. And where many commentators have pointed out that, of course, they'll have specialized ethnopharmaceutical knowledge or, right, ethnobotanical knowledge, which may aid in the treatment of illness. It is also the case that some people have said, well, a great deal of what they're producing is probably through the placebo effect. And one of the things I wanted to point out was that in a certain sense, to write it off as the placebo effect sort of begs the question, since it's not as though the placebo effect is especially well understood. There is a kind of leveraging of a mind-body connection to produce somatic effects in the placebo effect, which, while it is the gold standard against which we measure sort of modern technological intervention, right? We measure drugs and things against placebo as a baseline. Placebo in and of itself is a somewhat remarkable idea. It's something that it seems like a natural emergence from the notion that, if we assume the mind and body are connected, then it shouldn't be so strange that events in the mind may be capable of having significant, bodily effect. And yet at the same time, for many people, it's counterintuitive, strange, right? It's a strange idea. And when you read certain accounts of it, it's hard not to sort of read it in vaguely supernatural terms, whether or not, in fact, it is. In addition to those things, of course, the shamanic groups are very often, of course, themselves sort of possessors of, masters of, and users of various kinds of what we would identify in the context of this course as dissociative states. So they're capable of using trance, which very often seems to be a kind of self-induced dissociation, a kind of auto-hypnosis. And they're capable of doing so to do things like channel voices from another world, right? Be possessed by spirits, be possessed by ancestors, right? So they may be temporarily sort of taken over so that they say things, with an authoritative voice of what is purported to be a kind of non-physical being. They have seemingly supernatural information is the idea, right? So this, of course, aligns very closely with the work that we were talking about artificial possession states, artificially induced possession states, and the relationship between these things and dissociating certain modules and reorganizing brain function in certain ways, right? In addition to that, they not infrequently will have seemingly some ability to sort of transmit those states, right? So, like a hypnotist, they're capable of putting other people into relatively deep trance states. And the boundaries on some of this stuff are, when you look at some of the material, it's pretty remarkable. So, for instance, one of the things you'll encounter in the literature that's sort of endlessly fascinating, and I think speaks to one of the core traits of sort of the sorcerer or the magician as we move forward, like with a cultural theme, is the idea that you really do not want to piss the shaman off, right? Because if you piss the shaman off, depending on the cultural group, there are a variety of things that they can do. So for instance, they can take away your name, right? Or simply pronounce you dead, at which point the rest of your tribal group, the rest of your community is going to suddenly either completely ignore you or is going to make as though you're dead. This is, of course, an extremely distressing state. And of course, as human beings, we are not lone wolves. It's a bizarre myth that some people seem to have. We are an intensely communal and cultural group of beings. We're very collective in terms of our processing and our well-being. And so being declared dead and pushed out of the tribe is effectively a death sentence. Many of these people are reported as having like wasted away or died shortly thereafter in various ways. And so you would really want to work to get back into the good graces and have sort of your name and your status as a living person restored. One thinks about this, and of course, one of the questions one might speculate on is, to what extent this is a social convention in the sense that we would normally think about it. Everybody agrees not to, and to what extent it is, a kind of, imposition in some sense. That's pretty speculative, but people have speculated in that direction, right? It's not uncommon to see shamans having a remarkable degree of seeming influence over people, which of course is construed as supernatural, but which we can also look at in terms of things like placebo, like dissociation, like hypnosis, right? The scope and scale of those sorts of effects on cognition is considerably greater than many people might have assumed prior to it sort of having been established empirically. Okay, so suffice it to say that they're a quite, sort of interesting group. And, the idea that, that they would just have placebo effect and so we should write them off, it's like, if you don't have other forms of medicine, the placebo effect, is far better than nothing. You're going to have somebody who has an effective ability to leverage that is going to be an enormous advantage, right, to a group in terms of survival over another group. Same goes for specialized ethnobotanical knowledge. But in addition to this, we often see a trend in shamanism, and this is similarly seems to go as far back as sort of cave paintings and images at Lascaux, right, and so on and so forth, which is that they have certain kinds of specialized roles relative to, say, hunting. So one of the most common depictions that we'll see in cave paintings, right, is the shaman as a theriomorphic figure, right? So like a person with the head of a stag, this kind of thing. And we know from kind of evidence, historically recorded evidence, that this was not uncommon, right? A shaman might, for instance, don a certain kind of headdress, right, which had stag antlers, at which point they will pantomime, right, the hunt in a certain kind of way. Now, what's happening there is quite fascinating, right? There is a pantomime that they're going through where they are, from their perspective, sort of inhabiting the natural motion, right? They're getting into the mindset, they're getting into the head of the thing which the group wishes to hunt. Now, the idea that is partly that this is sort of meant to, through sympathetic means, right, attract hunting animals. It's sort of supposed to set good conditions for a hunt. But the other thing is that very often, after emerging from this state where they are, acting as the prey animal, they will give a report as to where the prey animal should be found. Okay. So there is this interesting mind sighting, in a sense, of the prey. And these states, if you watch them, are often quite remarkable. Like if you've ever seen a really skilled physical performer doing pantomime of any kind, you can attest to the sort of uncanny aspects of it, right? Like a really great mime, and I'm not a really good mime, but a really great mime, right, is remarkable. And we will talk a little bit later about that and about some of the kind of proposed neurological theories for what might be happening there and why they might render certain kinds of capacities, right? Like they might amplify them considerably in human beings because of the kind of loops that they create. So overall, we have this image that the shaman is this somewhat remarkable figure within their cultural group. And a big part of it is specifically their access to a broader suite of altered states through drumming, through dance, through various kinds of substances, through trance, through fasting, et cetera, et cetera. In addition, right, if we're looking at this with the kind of general hypothesis we've been building, then we can look at this as a set of novel connection patterns, novel neuroconnective patterns within the brain that are yielding certain kinds of novelty and probably, right, bringing up material from the unconscious, which they might not have access to within a sort of regular set of states, right? Normal waking sets of states. So there is an individual access, which we can assume that they have by moving between these states, right? In addition to that, and this is something that we will explore at greater length later, but in the ritual context in which they operate, they are also, of course, using specific kinds of psychotechnologies, not just to affect the network properties within their own brain, but to affect the network properties between their brain and other brains, okay? And you'll recall, I'm doing a bit of a callback here, but like for any given brain cell or any given module broadly construed within the brain itself is environment. These things are not distinguishing between, right, other areas within the brain and the world at large. There is no natural distinction. There's no sort of, magic essence that they pick up on. The point is that for each, semi-autonomous region within the brain, the rest of the brain is environment. Now, it is not environment if they're tightly integrated, right? Then there is a fluency of information, a transparency, as we previously discussed. There's a transparency of information that comes with integration such that those things become sort of a coherent, integrated functional unit. However, everything else that they're interacting with that's below that particular integration threshold, that's dissociated to some extent, right, necessarily others, okay? Now, that's a line that operates both ways. Again, we're going to expand on this, but if you consider, for instance, Andy Clark's idea of the natural-born cyborg, right, that we are naturally, as human beings, sort of cyborg creatures, we tend to incorporate technologies and things into ourselves very readily. So that's a technology. This, which I won't take off, is a technology, clothes, which we all wear, et cetera, right? But also it's very natural for us to extend, and this is not limited to humans, but to extend our sense of self into anything that we have a reasonably short feedback loop to, okay? So if something is sufficiently responsive in a feedback loop, then we will extend our sense of identity into it, right? So think about playing a video game, you're controlling the character, right? If you are controlling the character fluidly, you will rapidly just come to identify at a certain level with it, right? There is just a fluid connection between what's happening and what's happening there. Likewise, right, when we operate a motor vehicle, operate a car, for instance, we pretty rapidly extend our sense of self to include the boundaries of the vehicle, right? It's that guy cut me off, not that guy cut my car off. It's I don't think I can fit into that spot, not I don't think my car can fit into that spot, right? We extend our sense of self, right? Whoa, he came close to me. Well, he kind of came close. He came close to your car. But the point is you have a kind of tight control loop over the car, and naturally speaking, you extend the boundary accordingly. Likewise, okay, when we did some of the first early work with cybernetic limbs, there was the belief early on that getting a cybernetic arm to interface with the brain, like a monkey brain, was going to be this enormous top-down programming task. We were going to have to program sensors to be able to pick up extremely sophisticated states within the brain. It was going to be like a massive programming challenge to get it to do anything at all. And this turned out, of course, to be completely wrong. It turns out that if you have a sufficiently acute and differentiated sensor system, right, you put that there and the brain begins to sort of shape itself, begins to neuroplastically shape itself to take advantage of that affordance. The brain is looking for opportunities, right? And as soon as it gets a tight integration, then all of a sudden you've got the monkey moving the arm around, and you have sort of the remarkable sight of seeing like a quadriplegic woman feed herself a piece of chocolate with a robot on it. If you've never seen this stuff, it's quite remarkable. So anything that we have a reasonably tight feedback loop with, right, we essentially have integrated. It becomes part of an identification of self. And so tight integration between areas tends to unify them. When that, on the other hand, moves apart, then things become opaque, they become othered, etc. So one of the interesting things that happens in these ritual contexts isn't just that the shaman is altering the neuroconnective patterning in their own brain, but rather that they're engaged in a state of distributed cognition. And there are a bunch of things that sort of indicate this when you look at groups involved in dance or chant or drumming or ritual in general. You'll tend to see synchronization of a number of different sort of biological measurements and metrics, right? You'll see heartbeat synchronization, you'll see brainwave synchronization, et cetera, et cetera. All of these things are indicative of the fact that you're seeing a kind of change in distributed cognition. And we'll get to this again more later, distributed cognition generally as a cultural practice, but keep it in mind when we're considering the notion of ritual, because of course there are some rituals which are conducted solo, many rituals which are conducted in a group, where the sort of change of neuroconnectivity, networking the brains together in a particular kind of way with particular kinds of processes and structures in place, is going to yield a particular kind of distributed processing. Okay, so shamans are the gatekeepers of this too, and this is something that's interesting to bear in mind. Now, before we go sort of too much deeper into that side of things, I want to introduce a concept to sort of expand on some of our theory from earlier lecture. So an earlier lecture, we dealt really specifically with the concepts around transparency and opacity, which is derived from Polanyi's work. Okay, and this notion of the transparency opacity shift, right? The shift from looking through to looking at. And we've discussed a variety of the ways in which that is highly relevant for sort of understanding many of the phenomena we're talking about. So for instance, as I mentioned, in the case of literacy, we see a case where we have a natural capacity to spoken language. You can drop any baby, any human baby in any human language group, and they are going to absorb that language. There is a sort of a natural predisposition in that direction. But literacy is an acquired ability. You have to drill people on it. And when it takes, it becomes a psychotechnology. Right? It is a kind of technique that is so drilled in that it creates a new sort of machine within the brain that then operates so automatically, as I pointed out, right, that the standard truth test relies on the fact that we cannot normally consciously intervene on it. And there is a transparency involved there, right? There is a transparency between the mark on the page, the sort of sound, and what the sound signifies, the concept. So these transparencies are operating normally anytime you have things tightly integrated, right? If information is transparently and fluidly processed through, you're going to tend to have this kind of transparency. And the transparency opacity shift relates in other ways to, and we'll do some exploration of this shortly, things like the concept of mindfulness, where engaging a kind of metacognitive faculty in mindfulness, it seems in part to be about training ourselves to stop looking through our thoughts transparently and instead look at our thoughts with opacity. And so the comparison here is removing one's glasses to clean the schmutz off of them. Never fails. To clean the schmutz off of them. Okay, so this idea from Polanyi of transparency opacity obviously has a wide variety of applications. I want to now supplement that with a second kind of axis that we're going to use to start charting in an attempt to begin to categorize some of these effects a little bit. And so the second thing that I want to talk about a little bit, and then I'll ground it out in terms of shamans as to why, is featural versus Gestalt, which is to say the construal level, okay? Featural versus Gestalt. So here we have the first axis that we discussed, right? Opacity versus transparency, we've covered that. What we want to add in is the second axis, Gestalt versus Featural. So what does this mean? Roughly speaking, okay, the axis of Gestalt versus Featural is about, Gestalt is about a high-level abstracted view of things, and Featural is about a low-level particularized view of things. To put it into the colloquial, Gestalt is the forest, Featural is the trees, right? So when we say we can't see the forest for the trees, right, what we're saying in a sense is the person is too locked into featural processing and not locked into Gestalt processing, right? They're too locked into the details and they're not getting the big picture. Now, the Gestalt versus featural axis is something that we see turn up pretty readily. And indeed, there's a good recent book, if you're not familiar with it, by recent-ish, by Ian McGilchrist, called The Master and His Emissary, that deals with this in some detail. So we have a fairly long-standing, since the 1970s, notion of the left and right hemisphere of the brain as being different, importantly. And when we talked about split brain experiments, right, obviously it's the case that each hemisphere of the brain is in some sense operating a kind of independent form of processing, independent personality, which when you sever the corpus callosum is apparently capable of operating somewhat independently. You know, your hand can undo your shirt on camera or keep you from smoking, etc., right? However, there is a traditional view of the left and right hemisphere of the brain, which often gets kind of popularized incorrectly as the left hemisphere is like the logical side and the right hemisphere is the artistic side. And that's not quite right. However, it is the case that when we look over studies, there are differences in processing. And in a way, we could summarize those at one level by saying that the left hemisphere, and this is generalizing across population, left-handed people seem to be different, ambidextrous people seem to be different, but for 90% of the population, the left hemisphere handles featural processing, and the right hemisphere handles Gestalt processing. That is to say, the left hemisphere is very concerned with the details, fine detail, right? And breaking things into fine identifiable detail. The right hemisphere, on the other hand, is in Gestalt. It's handling the big picture. So the left hemisphere, featural trees, the right hemisphere, Gestalt forest. Now, one of the things that is sort of fascinating about this is that we can manipulate this construal level, okay, and that's what this axis is. It's the construal level between Gestalt and Featural. We can manipulate this construal level experimentally in various ways. So one of the oldest experimental paradigms for doing this, coming out of 1977, I think, is Navon letters. Navon letters, that's N-A-V-O-N, Navon letters. Okay, so on the left, that is a Navon letter. So you can see roughly how this works, right? You can look at it and what is it? Well, it's an S, but it's made of H's. It's an S made of H's. Okay, so what exactly is happening here? What's interesting about this? Well, we know that, when we ask people to pay attention to one aspect or the other in this, we can drive their processing in certain kinds of ways that is going to affect their performance on construal level tasks. So if we ask people to name the large scale letter, in this case, the S, we're driving their cognition in the direction of the Gestalt, right? You are gestalting together these individual elements towards the big picture. In a sense, you are hedging out, right, the small h's in order to capture the large S. If you look at it briefly in the white, actually, I often find that when I sort of stare at it for a bit, my brain gestalts it, I notice that there is almost a kind of like phantom thread that connects it together perceptually, as though my brain is superimposing additional structure to make it a continuous S that is not in fact there. So if you get somebody to pay attention to that large scale, right, the Gestalt, you're going to tend to shift their processing in certain ways. That's going to turn up in certain other kinds of tests. Okay, if on the other hand, you get them to pay attention to the small scale H, you're going to drive their processing towards the featural, right? So they will tend to notice the individual H's, right? And not so much notice this large scale thing. And when you give them subsequent tests about their construal level, that's going to tend to drive their perception in certain ways. So this is kind of a classic experimental paradigm. Again, Navon letters. Now, in particular, this is interesting because we see differential effects with people who have seen different kinds of brain insults, depending on where those brain insults were registered language center-wise hemispherically. So when people have damage to their left hemisphere, if you give them a basic Navon letter task, you show them this S made of H's, and you ask them to reproduce it, the damage to their left hemisphere means that they're no longer processing the small scale featural level, right? So when you ask them to reproduce this figure, what they do is they just draw a big S. They draw a single big S, right? They are picking up the large scale context, right, of this structure, but they aren't picking up the individual components of it. If, on the other hand, they have brain insult, brain injury on the right hemisphere, and you get them to do this task, you show them this image and you ask them to reproduce it, what you're going to tend to get is a scattering of H's, right? So with damage to their right hemisphere that does Gestalt processing, you're getting a scattering of H's. And the H's don't form a particular S shape, right? There's no sort of underlying Gestalt structure binding them together. It's just sort of a scatter shot of H's, right? So this is a very interesting dimension within the processing of our experience, our moving between the featural and the Gestalt, to what extent we can sort of zoom in and zoom out on the details, right? Zooming into the featural, zooming out to the Gestalt, getting the big picture. And as we'll see, there are a number of processes that rely, in fact, on the motion back and forth between these two states, right? It's something that we typically do very fluidly in the course of our day, right? We can zoom in, we can zoom out, but sometimes we get locked in the wrong construal level, right? We don't see the forest for the trees. Okay, now this figure on the right, okay, is to some extent an interesting version of this, okay? And it illustrates a little something about how this construal system works. Okay, so when you look at this thing, you, I presume, can read it, right? Or you are reading it. And what do you read it as? I'm assuming you read it as the cat. Now, the fun thing about this particular figure traditionally is that, right, as you can see, the center letter of both of these three-letter words is identical. In this case, it is completely literally identical. I've cut and pasted it, although it seems to be producing a funny little optical illusion effect, but it is literally identical. I copied and pasted it to produce this. So it's identical. Now that figure in the center is, if you look closely at it, neither an A nor an H, right? It's a little too sloped inward to be a proper H, but it's not quite met at the top enough to be an A. It's neither, right? So the thing that's interesting about this is that in the top, you perceive it as an H, and in the bottom, you presumably perceive it as an A, the cat. Okay, so you perceive the same figure in context as a different letter. Now, traditionally, when people looked at this and they were trying to figure out basically the problem of reading, how do we read? Because it seems like in order to read the word, we have to first read the letters. Okay, in order to read the word, we have to first read the letters, right? So if you want to know what a word is, you have to read the letters, right? Oh yeah, T-H-E, good, the, right? C-A-T. Except in this particular case, in order to figure out the letter, to disambiguate the nature of the letter, you have to somehow get a sense of the gestalt of the word, right? So we require the top-down processing of the gestalt and the bottom-up processing of the featural, and this forms a loop. And so, a traditional interpretation of this would have said, hence, reading is impossible, right? It has an infinite loop where we somehow have to, right, in order to read the individual letter, we need the gestalt, but in order to read the gestalt, we need the featural, and so, what do we do? Well, the thing is that these systems, the top-down system of gestalt and the bottom-up system of featural, are in fact constantly in operation, both of them, okay, both in a dynamical loop with each other, so there's a kind of loop between them, but also it appears in a state of opponent processing. They're both constantly in a state of tug of war, right, where they're in a state of tension over processing. And so, presumably, you have no reason not to be able to read this. You don't have any trouble with it at all, right? So the cat, you automatically disambiguate it, despite the fact that it is a highly ambiguous piece of information. So this is an interesting application, and it tells you a little bit about the relationship between the gestalt and the featural. I don't know about the application of this particular the cat experiment to people that have hemispheric damage or to people who have a severed corpus callosum, split brain persons. That would be an interesting question. It's very likely that work has been done, and I'm just not familiar with it or not remembering it, but it is kind of an interesting question. Okay, so this is, as you'll see, going to plug in very interestingly in terms of our accounts of psychotechnology, which is one of the reasons why I want to stress this, okay? So featural and gestalt, trees, forest, right? Bottom up, top down, okay? And this is the sort of second axis that we're going to introduce here, because we're going to start using this to, again, attempt to construct some sense of a multidimensional state space in which we can think about different altered states, different states of consciousness occurring. And indeed, in which we can think about certain kinds of states deliberately pushing us into, right, particular areas of processing to achieve certain kinds of effects, right? So in the same way as, calling somebody's attention to one end of the construal level or the other end of the construal level, right? Making them pay attention to the H's or making them pay attention to the S can drive their processing, and that effect turns up in subsequent tasks, right? Similarly, we're going to show that a number of altered states and a number of the psychotechnologies designed to produce them likewise are going to push on our construal level, right? They're going to push us in the direction of Gestalt and Featural, and also, of course, as we'll sort of outline, push us between opacity and transparency, and this is going to have all kinds of interesting knock-on effects. Okay, so I wanted to establish this extra axis, Gestalt and Featural, and like I said, if you want to read an absolutely fascinating book on the subject, I highly recommend Ian McGilchrist's The Master and His Emissary. It does have something of a quality of, I don't know, cultural commentary, maybe a little bit of political polemic in it, because as many modern commentators, since we sort of figured out, like brain lateralization have done, Ian McGilchrist believes that we are sort of excessively left-brained, that we become excessively concerned with left-brain processing in our culture. There are earlier books that played with this line. So one of the most fascinating, it's a strange book, right? But it's The Origin of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. It's a weird book, totally worth reading. I don't think it's the case, which is to say, I'm not sure that it literally depicts an accurate narrative for how the things that it describes came about, but it's nevertheless extremely thought-provoking and fascinating. So if you're interested in this kind of stuff, its basic hypothesis is that our right brain basically didn't used to be in direct contact in some sense with our left brain. And so we experienced the sort of impingements of our right brain into our left brain as divine presentation, right? That's the gods speaking to us in our heads. And so this is a fascinating idea. It's very strange. You can see that it does share actually some relationships with the kind of dissociation-based hypotheses that we're going to be playing with on these states, right? In terms of parts separating out and impinging back towards consciousness. I don't happen to agree with the particular narrative that it has running in it around that in the specifics, but the Gestalt is fascinating. So Gestalt and Featural, okay? I want you to sort of internalize this second axis. Okay, with that in mind, let's talk a little bit about psychotechnology, but first let's talk a bit about sort of one of the signature shamanic psychotechnologies, okay? So one of the signature shamanic psychotechnologies, one of the things that is really deeply associated with shamanic practice, okay, is movements into another world. So within sort of the cultures that are shamanic, very often there is sort of a tripartite world, right? This is, as I've said before, I think largely grounded in the kind of embodied metaphors of our culture. Up is good in every culture in the world. Up is kind of metaphorically cognate with good, down is bad. And so you get a kind of three world view. There is the material world such as it exists around us, and then there is, often the realm of the gods above and the underworld below. Now that may or may not have the same kind of like good and evil valence, right? In many cultures, it's not necessarily the case that just because somebody lives above you in that sense that they're, beneficent and wonderful. And the gods of the underworld are not always the devil, right? This is a funny thing that you see sometimes, like Hades, for instance, or Pluto, right? The like syncretic Greco-Roman god of the underworld isn't really evil. He's really more like morose. He kind of got the leftovers, right? He's a very like dull, slightly unforgiving figure, but he's, given to rule over the dead. It's not a realm of torture. It's just a realm of passionlessness, right? Eternal passionlessness. He's kind of morose and sad figure. But culturally speaking, that doesn't square for us a lot of the time. And so, for instance, if you look at Disney's Hercules, of course, they promptly took that character and mashed him up with the devil. They made him fire-based, and they gave him little demons, and they made him the bad guy, right? And they had him played by James Woods, which was, I think, a very inspired piece of casting. So, we love this idea of doing that, but really, technically, it's the underworld is not necessarily so bad. But the point is, right, there is a kind of the world, and then there is an underworld, and there is, in some sense, an overworld. Minimally, you will get the idea of the spirit world, okay? So there is the regular world in front of us, and then there is a spirit world, and that spirit world tends to be closely associated with altered states. The spirit world is a place that the person believes, right, that these cultures believe is accessed in dream, right? That's a trip into the spirit world. It's accessed in trance, in various kinds of what we would think of as visionary states, secondary to hallucination, right, for sort of psychedelics and compounds of this kind, and the forms of visions and hallucinations that occur through certain kinds of physical mortifications, right? Pain, sleep deprivation, right? Sensory deprivation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, all the things we've discussed. So when one moves out of sort of ordinary reality, right, that set of relatively ordinary, stable conscious states, it's deemed that they're sort of moving into the spirit world, right, in some important sense, into a kind of non-physical reality. And one of the shaman's sort of signature features is a command over and a control over the techniques and the ability to move into this space in a controlled fashion. The shaman is the member of the group who can go into this world and bargain or negotiate or threaten or otherwise interact with spiritual powers in a relatively direct sense. The shaman can move between worlds. So the shaman, this is often conceived as the notion of the shaman's soul leaving their body, right? So in some cases, this appears to be described in a fashion not dissimilar to the way that accounts of astral projection or out-of-body experience are described, if you're familiar with these things. And these are both concepts that, again, it's, tricky to try to find some grounding for these things in sort of a naturalistic term, right? They tend to be couched in a supernatural explanatory framework a lot of the time. They tend to be sort of, occult in their explanations, out-of-body experiences and astral projection. But if, again, we simply take it as, okay, there are enough accounts of this experience, right, that there is something happening here. We don't know what it is, but there's something happening. There's an experience happening. Then we can begin to differentiate, importantly. And the differentiation that we make is between the language of training and the language of explanation. The language of training and the language of explanation. The language of training often has images and concepts and so on and so forth that are what are useful for human beings to pick up the skill in question necessary to do something. But that's not the same as the language of explanation, which is the underlying metaphysic. It's what is actually going on at some level, right? At some level. So it's what's actually going on. A good, very quick example of this is the dictum that people are given when they undertake mindfulness meditation training, right? And the dictum that people are given is that you should be non-judgmental, right? Non-judgment. This is the thing that people are told over and over and over again. But that isn't literally true. It can't be literally true. Because if you were actually non-judgmental, then you wouldn't bother treating any of your thoughts any differently at all. And that's not the case. When you're following your breath and you're attempting, right, you're trying to catch when you're off track and thinking about the date you had last night or your laundry list, right? You're not being non-judgmental. You're saying, oh, I'm not following the breath. That's a judgment. Okay. Now, it's the case that using the language of training in this sense, non-judgmental is meant to convey something. It's meant to convey that you aren't being a harsh self-critic, right? That you're not being a harsh self-critic and coming at yourself in certain kinds of ways, because that's counterproductive. It doesn't work well. You need to befriend your mind. But the point is that it's not the case, literally speaking, that you are being non-judgmental. You are still making judgments necessarily. So there is a difference here between the language of training and the language of explanation. That is likewise how we're going to approach this kind of thing and a great number of things, right? That sometimes the language of training uses certain kinds of images, metaphors, concepts, etc., because they're relatively easy handles for human cognition to grab a hold of to pick up the skill procedurally, but that they're not necessarily congruent with the underlying metaphysics, right, that we want to use to explain something. So given that kind of notion, let's take it for an instance that, right, indeed, people do seem to report experiences which are like out-of-body experiences. They are, in fact, widely reported, right? People do, in fact, seem in some conditions to report experiences of astral projection. And in both of these cases, people have the seeming experience phenomenologically of leaving their bodies and often going to another realm. Well, this is very closely aligned with what we see reported by shamans, that they have this ability, right, through sort of states, through trance, whatever, to leave their body and to enter the spirit world. And that in many ways that forms the keystone for sort of their general practice, right? They tend not to be sort of magical in the ceremonial tradition that we think of in the later magical traditions of the West, where they're like casting spells. They tend to be bargainers with spirits. They may have a certain amount of innate power, mana, but this in some contexts, that's a Polynesian thing. But right. But the point is that a lot of that is about charisma. It's about force of will, right? In sort of bargaining with entities within this other space. Okay. So I'm going to leave off this section here. We're going to pick this up shortly. And so we're going to unpack a little bit more what the relationship of this, right, spirit flight, leaving the body, view from above, is to both philosophical traditions, where we actually see the shamanic being introduced to philosophical traditions fascinatingly early, even among the Greeks, but also how we're going to link that up to this construct that we've set up around, right, opacity, transparency, and construal level. Right? So transparency, opacity, and construal level, and begin to build out from that to an account of more generalized practices, including meditation, prayer, magic, ritual, etc. So we're going to try to build out from there.